You've experienced a crisis, right? Sometime. Maybe you're living through one or in one right now. Today, we're talking about being better prepared for your next crisis and using that preparation to get better results and increase your resilience. Doesn't that sound like a good use of your time? If so, you're in exactly the right place. Welcome to another live episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we're helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you're listening to this podcast, you could have been with us live, and you can find out how to do that on your favorite social channel by checking in and joining one of our online groups, either on Facebook or LinkedIn. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to join us and get access to all future live episodes. Today's episode is brought to you by Remarkable Development Sessions. A Remarkable Development Session is a webinar for the new world of work. We know that we learn in interaction with others, but in a fractured and increasingly virtual world, the workshop experience has shifted to a focus on simply delivering the content and leaving all of the application to you as an individual. And even if you love learning from webinars, you've likely thought there has to be a better way, a way to make a webinar better than they currently are. And if you've thought that, you have the same thought as we do. So you can learn more about what we're doing about that and sign up for a future one of our sessions by going to kevineikenberry.com/remarkable development. You can see what we're up to and where you can join us there. Our guest today, and let me bring her in before I introduce her. There she is. Our guest today is Lynn Perry Wooten. She's an academic, an expert on organizational development and transformation, and the president of Simmons University, the first African-American to lead the institution. She is the co-author with Erica H. James of The Prepared Leader: Emerge from Any Crisis More Resilient Than Before. Before moving to Simmons, she served as the David J. Nolan Dean and Professor of Management and Organizations at the Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management. Before that, she served on the faculty at the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business for nearly 20 years. She holds a bachelor's degree from North Carolina A&T State, an MBA from Duke's Fuqua School of Business, and a doctorate from the University of Michigan. She lives in Massachusetts. She's actively involved in her community, and she is our guest today. Lynn, I'm
Kevin, it is great to be here because being a remarkable leader is being a prepared leader.
Being a prepared leader. So I want to start here because we got a little bit of your journey from what I just shared, but what sort of led you to this kind of work? Like sort of what led you to this place? You didn't wake up when you were 10 and say, this is what I want to do with my life.
Yeah, I did not wake up. I wanted to be a professor. I was one of those nerdy, geeky people who wanted to be a professor. But if you would have told me that I was going to study crisis leadership and write books about it, that is not the case. My co-author, Dean Erica James of the Wharton School of Business, and I have been co-authors for a quarter of a century. We've been friends since graduate school. And when we were young assistant professors, we started studying the Texaco discrimination lawsuits and really did a deep dive in how organizations manage crisis for discrimination lawsuits. That spread out to look at natural disasters and product defects and all types of organizational crisis. So that's how it started.
So you are an expert on crises. We're going to get to crisis in a second, but the book is titled The Prepared Leader. You've already said that. We've already mentioned that. But the question that I have for you is, what's the big idea of the book?
Yeah, the big ideal is Erica and I have taught all types of business students, undergrads, executives, MBAs, and doctoral students. And we talk about the 3 Ps. Everybody who goes through business school leadership journey knows that even if it's a nonprofit, you got to make the finances work. That's the first P, profits. People are our biggest assets. And we can talk about the labor shortage, and that's a crisis. In the last decade, we've talked about the planet and sustainability. But the big ideal is nobody tells you that you have to be a prepared leader, that every day you're waking up and you're seeing around the corner or you're in the midst of that next crisis and it's happening. But you can learn how to lead in the crisis situation. You can prepare for it. There's a set of skills. It's understanding the phases, and it can be done well. You mentioned in my career that I studied at the University of Michigan and was on the faculty there for 19 years. One of the things at Michigan we talk about is the Center for Positive Organizational Scholarships. And we talk about this notion that remarkable leaders are positively deviant. And that's the other big ideal in this book. How do I show up in a crisis and deviate from the norm and instead be positively deviant? So do crisis well.
And there's another thing that you argue or purport early in the book, which I think is really interesting, and that is that if we're living through a crisis, we've lived through that one before. Like,
Yeah.
sort of nothing. My words now. Nothing's new. Like it's happened before. So, and people might be saying, "Well, wait a minute. We never lived through COVID before." But you're making a bigger point. You're making a bigger point. So I'd like you to talk about that for a second, like because we end up in the crisis moment saying, "Well, this has never happened before," and yet often it has. And even if that exact thing hasn't, something similar enough has, and that's where the preparation comes in. Talk about that for a minute.
Yeah. And the preparation is all about learning. It is funny. You're right. You go back to March of 20, and all of us were saying we had never lived through a pandemic, but we had the big influenza crisis in the 1800s. We had SARS. We had swine flu. As Americans, we just thought it wasn't going to come here. But someone has lived through a pandemic. That was our ego, right? That's how we are. But someone has lived through a pandemic. So part of being a prepared leader is constantly learning. And I call this learning multi-directional. It requires you to go back into history to see how similar crises have happened in history. It requires you to think about the future and scan the environment for learning. And it also entails learning inside your organization and outside the organization. All of the things that we did with the pandemic, a lot of it was historical learning, and we just innovated to prepare to resolve it.
Yeah, so I don't think we could, as we're here having this conversation at the end of 2022, and even if people are listening in 23 or whenever, for us to be having a conversation about crisis and not talk about the pandemic at least a little, because
Right.
we did all live through it. And so my question would be this: what are the lessons that we as leaders need to remember? I'm not going to say learn. What do we need to remember?
What do we need to remember? The first one really does require leaders have to spend time looking at early warning signals and detections. When we started seeing the pandemic in China, how many of us were really paying attention? I can be honest, I was only paying a little bit of attention because I was at Cornell and I had to bring home students who were studying abroad. But most of the world wasn't paying attention. Then when it got to Seattle, I still didn't want to pay attention, even though one of my board meetings was canceled. Well, that's just an anomaly in Seattle. So paying attention. Teams and leaders have to constantly be scanning their environment and paying attention. Once you know the crisis is hitting, you need to think about, okay, how am I going to prepare for it? What planning do I need to do? Am I going to have to shut down the university? Am I going to have to shut down the business? All of those are types of things that we can learn how to do. We can have that skill set. So it's the preparation and scanning the environment is what I hope people will remember.
I think that I'd like you to comment on this because because you said already that the prepared leader is positively deviant. They take a positive approach to things.
Right.
So the question that I think the conundrum is this: I scan the environment and I see something and I notice it, and yet I want to take a positive approach. Like, what's the balance between not going into panic, right, and still being positive?
And sometimes going into panic is good. And so you're exactly right. You have to have that balance because we know as humans, when we go into panic, that charges us up to do things differently. So I talk about this notion of resiliency. And the first phase of resiliency is going into panic. And the constant example I give is why were all of us hoarding toilet paper and paper towels? We went into panic, right, Kevin? We didn't know how to live in this particular pandemic. I was in Ithaca BJ's Club, stopping up on everything the week before the world shut down with my 20-year-old. So yes, but panic mode should fuel you to say, okay, let me give myself some grace. Let me take a break here and then start going into what do I have to learn in this new world order? How do I live in a pandemic? How do I lead my organization? How do I lead my university for me? How do I manage my team? And it's not only learning, but how do I grow and become better in the process? That's the opportunity. That is where Dean James and I saw the positively deviance. It's learning plus growth to be better. But you can only get through that learning and growth by first, you have to contain the damage. So we shut down the country. And then you have to think about the recovery mode. But first, you have to contain any crisis you have to contain natural disasters, product defects, social reckonings, and then move on to the learning and the growth. And so it is a lot of balance.
So I think most of us, when we think of the word crisis, we sort of say, uh-oh, right? Like,
Right.
So the question is this, and I know what your answer is going to be, but I think it's an important thing for us to talk about. So crisis, is it a threat or is it an opportunity?
You knew what my answer was going to be because you read
Well, I've read the
book.
book, so I do know, but it's an important thing for us to talk about.
But it is, and it's how you frame it. How are we going to make this an opportunity for us? And the opportunity is, are we going to improve as a team or organization? Are we going to make systems change? Are we going to be on the forefront of innovation? And the one of the examples we like to give is you think about how General Motors, I mean, both of us have Midwestern roots somewhat, managed the crisis. General Motors, one of the things that they did is that we got this big manufacturing plant and America needs PPE. Let's shut down and stop making cars because we need some PPE and we can use our manufacturing plant. But not only did General Motors do that, while they were making the PPE, somewhere in the back office, they were also strategizing the future of electric cars. And so it's that parallel thing of containing the crisis, resolving the crisis, but also thinking about the future. Another favorite company I talk about is how Delta Airlines managed the crisis. They were the ones that say, we're not going to sell the middle seat. We're going to be leaning on our frequent flyer programs. We're going to make sure our employees have well-being prioritized. All of these are examples of crisis containment and changing the system also.
Yeah, I think they're great examples, and I think that we can look to make it an opportunity. And you talked about the word framing, and I want to get to framing a crisis more in a second. But before that, I just want to have you tie everything you've said back to this idea of preparation, because so far we've really been talking about living in it. How do we now think? How do we think forward into being prepared for
the next crisis? Yeah. The scene around the corner requires that you look at your organizational systems. And even before you get to the systems, Kevin, you need to think about individual leaders. What skill sets do they have today, and what skill sets will they need in the future for the prepared, whether it be your finance person or your IT person, your chief diversity officer. So it's constantly asking yourself the skill sets currently and the skill sets today. The next phase of preparing for the next crisis is your team ready? If you don't have a good team, you're probably not going to thrive and be resilient in the crisis. Teams need to learn how to work together. They need to know how to defer to the expert in the room. They need to be able to take the collective wisdom and experience and channel it into a crisis. And at the end of the day, the team should always be able to perform so that the sum is greater than the parts. And so team, we have a whole chapter on team. We have whole tools on teams. And then the final thing is this systems thinking. We have to get beyond that it's just my company, it's just my team. All the different systems that can contribute to the crisis. And are you partnering with them in advance? You look at why were we able to come up with a vaccine? Because the United States created a mega community where we brought the nonprofit sector, the government, and the corporate sector. That's a systems thinking. As remarkable leaders, are you prepared? Are you working with those systems so that you can get on the phone the next crisis and have those partners?
Yeah, I think that's that last statement is worth underlining, everybody. Some of you are doing this while you're jogging or you're running or whatever. But that point of being prepared in part by being prepared with the relationships.
Right.
A super important piece. There's a lot in the book. And Lynn, I like to pride myself on trying to ask things that others might not. And while there's all sorts of great stuff in here about crisis management and the skills and all that, there's a particular piece that I found especially interesting and illuminating and different. And I'd love for us to talk about it. And it goes around this word framing. You basically suggest that there are 4 ways
Right.
that leaders might frame a crisis, 4 choices that we have. And so talk about
Definitely want to talk
how
about
that happens. But also, I guess before we even get into what they are, I'd love to just, like we probably all have a bias. Like
we probably all have a bias.
one
I'm
of
taking my
these
book
without
out. So I
knowing.
can make, yep. And Kevin, I'd be interested, and you'll say you're interviewing me. I want to hear how you think about framing crisis too, because we all have a bias. So for those of you who may choose to buy the book or go on the website, we talk about the 4 frames, and they're really based upon Dylan Bowman's research and how we start out when we think about those frames. So some of us think about things from a culture frame. It's all about how we manage organizational culture, the symbolic artifacts, the statements that we want to make, um, caring about people, the well-being, ensuring that the organizational culture is equipped for the crisis. And these are the people-centered people. So that the culture frame is one. And as a university president living in the provost, I thought a lot about culture. I thought about social identities. I thought about the culture of the different groups in my organization. I thought about the university culture and what I wanted to preserve during the pandemic. So then the next frame we actually talk about this notion is the notion of the political frame, right? There's this political frame. And some people we know it's how they manage power in politics. It's thinking about the interactions of the crisis. Do I need government agencies, the political things inside the organization, how people get along, all of those type of things, my political partners, how I build a coalition to make sure that I'm resolving the crisis. A third phase is to think about the structural frame. And my engineering colleagues like to think about the structural frame. How do I organize things? How do I arrange it? My team are all important in this notion of the structural frame. And those are all important. And then there's this notion of the human relations frame too, the people. And so we start with Dillman and Bowman's frame as the foundation. But Kevin, we expand beyond that, and we know from research that there are even gender differences in how people frame. I just did an op-ed for one of the Boston newspapers where we talked about, women frame things differently, where they focus a lot on building trust. They're going to show their vulnerability. They're going to juggle multiple balls at the same times. And we know from research that the male type of framing of a crisis situation is everything's black and white. Let's just charge through. We could not have lived through 2020 also and talk about even this notion of global framing and global cultural competencies and the way we see things. And I said early on about as Americans, how we see crisis are very different. So, and we go even into the global framing to talk about, the self versus communal framing, how we manage time and all those differences. And then finally, what speaks passions to me is the generational framing and how generations have handled this crisis. And each of us will be different because of what generation we're in.
So you talk about them in the book, and you especially the first 4 you spend the most time on in the book. But one of the a wise person told me after I finished one of my books, what did you learn after you wrote it, but before it came out? And so you gave us some others frames that maybe didn't get brought out quite as much in the book, but I think they're incredibly valuable. But I want to go back to the first 4,
right?
And say that the thing that I found most interesting, and I agree with, is that the right answer is likely not found in any one of them. But in some combination of them. So let's talk about that, because that adds a level of complexity. It adds a level of ambiguity. It adds a whole bunch of other stuff. But talk about what you mean by that.
Yeah. It goes back again to leading in a crisis requires your brain to constantly spin. And every time you're thinking about a crisis, you're navigating all these frames, Kevin. You're doing the political map of who needs to be in the room, who's not in the room. Who do I need to be my political partners? Who do I need to build a coalition with? But you can't just focus on politics, right? You also have to think about the infrastructure, that's going to help you lead the crisis. And you need someone that's lead the infrastructure. And then on the softer side, you have to think about the people and the organizational culture that you want to get. And part of this framing requires you to ask the tough questions. And one of the fundamental questions I always say, and I learned from my colleague Bob Quinn, is in every crisis situation, you have to ask yourself, what are the results I'm trying to produce? And given the results that I'm trying to produce, how do I navigate these various frames of crisis leadership? But constantly asking yourself that. And your values have to be aligned with that too. And that's what the culture frame does too.
I think that question is so important because once we're in the crisis, while panic can amp us up a bit, as you said earlier, it can also make us single-minded and like all we're trying to do is get through this, or we're looking at every moment as a mountain rather than like what are we really trying to accomplish here. It's kind of like lifting our eyes back to the bigger picture. I think is incredibly valuable because otherwise we can get very much stuck in being whipsawed by this situation, and that situation.
Yeah. My co-author talks about at some point with her team, she said to them, okay, we're going to get through this pandemic crisis as a business school. And I need to step aside and let this team lead the crisis. And I have to go on and think about strategic things and big pictures. And so we all get to that point of at some point, we have to let the team, the experts, lead and navigate the four frames that I talk about in the book. And then others of us have to set us aside. Sometimes they talk about going this to the balcony and being an adaptive leader and seeing the horizon for the future. But Kevin, as you may recall, that requires trust. And trust is a big part of leading in a crisis situation.
I would say that whichever frame you want to talk about here and whatever, all of the skills that you talk about in the book that will help us manage a crisis, I would argue that this is the one that if we invest in it always ahead of time, that will give us perhaps the biggest lever for all the rest once we get into the crisis itself.
Right. And that goes back to, it's funny that you say invest in it, because often when I'm teaching trust, I talk about the trust bank. In the book, we talk about the trust wheel and mapping out how you're investing in that trust. And to do trust, we talk about the 3 C's. One is we need competent people. We're only going to believe in remarkable leaders if they're competent in a situation. They can do the job. They show up, they bring their experience, their expertise, and their execution capability. But beyond competent, you have a contractual obligation. If you're my CFO, I'm expecting you to be the finance person. What's your contract? And then historically, in leading a crisis, it's all been about communicating. That's the 3rd C. Now, Kevin, Erica doesn't like me to talk about that. We've been studying it for a long time because I tell our age, but the crisis part of communication has always
called wisdom, Lynn. It's called wisdom.
It's always been in there, except the rules of the game for communication have changed. Before you did a press release, you may have done you might be on the TV news. Now you have to do a press release. You have to be on the news. You have to know social media. I tell people literally in my house in Ithaca, my high school daughter was creating videos for me to communicate to the various stakeholders during the crisis. So you have to do it all: YouTube videos, social media, press releases, emails, and mapping out the various stakeholders and the communication channels. Those all help to build trust.
100%. What else? Is there something, Lynn, that we haven't talked about? Obviously, there's lots more we could talk about. But is there anything else we haven't talked about that you think maybe we left out or you feel led to share right now?
I think one of the things building upon trust is that leaders always have to do stakeholder mapping. And that goes back to your question about the frames, and especially the political frame. Who are the stakeholders that are going to be impacted by the crisis? How are they going to be influenced? And how am I taking care of those stakeholders? How am I stewarding them? Customers, students, for me, faculty, staff, suppliers, just do a stakeholder map and understand how the crisis will impact them and how I can take care of them. Often we forget. And don't play stakeholders against each other. Our roles as a leader is just like we have to love all our children. We have to love all of our stakeholders and take care of them and ensure that their well-being is being managed in the crisis situation.
Perfect. So I've got a couple more questions before we wrap up. And so we're going to shift gears, if you will. So Lynn, what do you do for fun?
What do I do for fun? Well, you know that when I'm not being Simmons president, I love to read and know that. I like to shop and I like to cook and spend time with family and friends.
There you go. Favorite dish to make?
So my favorite dish to make is I'm known for my 7 cheese macaroni and cheese. That's what I'm known for. I have Parmesan and smoked
I'm
Gouda,
ready
and a
to come.
variety of
I'm ready
cheddars
to
in
visit.
there.
I'm ready to visit anytime. All right. So speaking of reading, the only question you knew for sure I was going to ask you is this one. Like, what are you reading these days?
Yep. Well, I am reading and thinking about my other book, which is Arrive and Thrive. So this is 7 impactful practices for women in organization. I lead a women-centric college and thinking a lot about how women in this post-pandemic world are going to continue to shatter and break the glass and concrete ceilings. So thinking a lot about women in
Perfect.
leadership.
And so where can we learn more? How can we get a copy of The Prepared Leader? Where do you want to point people?
Yep, you can get it on
Things you want to
Amazon.
know.
You can get it from Wharton Press. You can get it from your local bookstore. We have all different types of forms, and look forward to having it as part of book clubs and discussions in the boardrooms and the team rooms.
Perfect. So before we go, everyone, I have a question for all of you. I've asked the questions that I had time to ask Lynn, not all that I have, but all that we had time for. So my question for you is this. It's the one I ask every week. Now what? What action are you going to take as a result of this conversation? What did you learn that you will now go apply? Because until we apply it, it makes very little difference rattling it around in our head. So maybe it's something about trust. Maybe it's something about one of the specific frames that we talked about. Maybe it's about thinking about how you make decisions differently in a crisis, how you keep both the operational and strategic things in mind, whatever it might be. Maybe you got something that will help you with the crisis that you are in right now. But unless you apply something, it really won't matter. So I hope that you will do that. And Lynn, I hope that you enjoyed yourself. I certainly enjoyed having you. Thanks so much for being here.
I definitely enjoyed it in the energy.
All right. So, we're here every week, everybody. So Lynn won't be back, but I will be. So I hope that you'll come back. And if you enjoyed this episode, especially if you're a leader somewhere in the middle of your organization, this episode, I think specifically, is one that would probably speak to more senior leaders in your organization. Share it with them. Share this episode with anyone that you think would find value in it. And make sure you come back next week for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We'll see you then.